So it's my pleasure to be able to chair this meeting this week. Fundamentalism and Science, Prophecy and Protest in an Age of Globalization is the title of Professor Torkel's book, actually recently published by CUP, I think. And he will introduce actually a panel discussion. Starting from the end, Dr. Torkel Brekke, Departmental Lecturer in Modern History of the Middle East here in Oxford, will contribute. Professor Richard Gombrich, formerly Bowden Professor of Sanskrit here, will also contribute. Stan Rosenberg, that's right, the next one there, Director of the Scholarship and Christianity in Oxford programme, and Dr. Fern Elston-Baker, who's Director of the Belief in Dialogue programme at the British Council, will also contribute. After they've all had their little say, they then all get a sort of a chance to comment on each other's. That's the panel discussion bit, at which point I expect in best Ian Ramsey Centre fashion the audience to be raring at the bit and wanting to go, and that's your chance to join in the discussion from that point onwards. I will attempt to get us to an end by 9:45, if at all possible, on the grounds that people do start to wilt a bit after that. But welcome everybody, and I hope we have a very good time, and particular welcome to Torkel Brekke, actually, who will introduce his topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Should I talk into that one? Or?
I think it's going to pick you up all right.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, let me first thank the Ian Ramsey Centre for hosting this debate about certain aspects of the book that you just mentioned, Mike. One key argument in that book is that fundamentalism is a reaction against certain aspects of modernization, that we can find in all world religions, starting at the earliest in the second half of the 19th century. An important aspect of modernization is the element of secularization that is often called differentiation. And differentiation is a process whereby the spheres are the function systems of society, that could be law, politics, science, education, etc., become independent of each other. And fundamentalist leaders and organizations struggle to reverse the process of differentiation. That is the key of any sound definition of fundamentalism. I want to start by that, just to have the basic concepts in order. For some years, I've used a book called Strong Religion to teach fundamentalism at my university, which is the University of Oslo. And that is an important book because it is a summary of key ideas in the final volume of a very important, very big research project called the Fundamentalism Project, coming out of the University of Chicago in the mid-1990s. The authors of the book Strong Religion argue that the fundamentalist hostility against science is a passing phenomenon. The argument is that science is itself showing signs of becoming more fragmented, less self-assured, and for that reason, religious believers will have less to fear in the future than they had in, let's say, the early 20th century, for instance. So what this book, Strong Religion, calls the third stage in the development of science might, I quote, free up metaphysical space that was previously occupied by, quote again, aggressive, unquestioning science. I'll return to this proposition after a brief look at the relationship between fundamentalism and science in some important religious traditions. I'm going to talk a bit about science in Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism, and I will not mention Christianity here because well, mostly because there's so many people here that know a lot more about Christianity than I do, and I think we're going to hear something about that from Stan and also from other people in the panel. But I intend to make two suggestions. Firstly, I think it's a good idea to distinguish clearly between two different religious reactions to science that I call, on the one hand, encompassment or possibly containment. The other reaction is rejectionism, or rejection. My suggestion is that the outright rejection of science is a true fundamentalist reaction. And yeah, I'll return to that, comparing a bit with the encompassment. My second suggestion is that I think there are good reasons to expect that the conflict between aspects of science, in particular evolutionary theory, and fundamentalism, will become more and not less important, not less heated in the future. Now, how did Muslims first react to the theory of evolution? Sayyid Ahmed Khan was probably the most prominent representative of modernist Islam in Darwin's own times. Khan took a very positive view of modern science to the extent that he advocated allegorical readings of the Quran in cases where the sacred text could not be aligned with science. In several tracts and articles appearing in the last decades of the 19th century, Khan wanted to demonstrate how the Quran could be reconciled with modern biological and geological theories. Using Quranic verses as the point of departure, Khan discussed the development of species from common ancestors, the concept of the survival of the fittest, and theories about the age of the earth. Science had to be reconciled with Islam, and the best way to do this was to show Muslims how modern science was really implied in the Holy Book from the start. So Islam encompassed modern science in the thinking of Sayyid Ahmed Khan. Mention should also be made of a key figure in the shaping of modern Islam during the late 19th century, Al-Afghani. In a text called The Truth About the Neycheri Sect and an Explanation of the Neycheris, published in 1880, Afghana attacked the philosophical position that he called Neycheris. The term Neycheri refers to naturalism. Nature is basically, yes, nature. In modern times, it was mainly Charles Darwin that had caused the new fashion of evolutionism, Afghani asserted. It implied that evolutionism was more of a generic theory that one could trace back to the Greeks. Afghani says about Darwin, I quote, "He wrote a book stating that man descends from the monkey, and that in the course of successive centuries, as a result of external impulses, he changed until he reached the stage of the orangutan." Afghani's treatment of Darwin's work was a caricature, and no more balanced than most Christian critics. So we could say that Sayyid Ahmed Khan and Al-Afghani were both modern Muslim thinkers, although they parted ways on certain questions. They both worked hard to find strategies to reconcile Islam with science, and very often they ended up asserting that science was okay because it was in fact encompassed or implied in the Quran. And this must be seen as a strategy of cultural self-assertion in the face of imperialism, I believe. Because at the same time as these people were working, there were large sections of the older Muslim elites, the ulama, that were hostile to science and tended to reject all ideas that were not obviously in line with the traditional understanding of Islam. The ulama in India and the Middle East in the 19th century often had little patience with modern science, and this, I think, was one reason for the decreasing relevance and the decreasing power of the ulama. The next important person in Muslim fundamentalism, or the most important really in the whole sort of early history of Muslim fundamentalism, is Maulana Maududi, the Indian thinker, active, died in 1979. And he, on science, he was quite ardent in rejecting evolutionary theory. And he did this on the same grounds as many of the Christian contemporaries. In the 1940s, Maududi wrote that the theory of evolution was in conflict with Islam's belief in a creator God. He dismissed suggestions by modernist Muslims that the Quranic story of the creation of Adam from clay could be read allegorically as evolution from simpler forms of matter to complex life forms. A main argument against the theory of evolution, according to Maududi, is the argument from design. But for Maududi, the greatest problem with the theory of evolution was not its conflict with theology, but rather its social and political consequences. Evolutionary thought equaled materialism, he asserted, and materialism caused humans to see themselves as unfettered by religious and moral constraints and treat each other in terrible ways. Although the theory of evolution was debated among Muslim intellectuals almost from the time that Darwin published On the Origin of Species in 1859, it was much later that anti-evolutionism became an organized movement in the Muslim world. This process started in Turkey in the 1980s, when several books by American Protestant creationists were translated into Turkish. Soon, in the 1980s, anti-evolutionism got a foothold in the educational system in Turkey, and the theory of evolution was in certain periods banned as a subject in primary and secondary schools. The most important among the Turkish Muslim anti-evolutionists is Adnan Oktar, who writes under the pen name Harun Yahya. Yahya is founder of an organization called the Science Research Endowment, which is active in anti-evolution campaigns targeted at key institutions and persons in Turkish society and abroad. He has published a very large number of books in Turkish, and many of these have been translated into English and other languages. His main idea is to refute evolutionary theory and prove that all life forms must have been created by God. In a book called Design in Nature, for instance, he goes through a number of phenomena, like the flight of insects and birds, to demonstrate how the natural world is full of what he calls irreducible complexity. Complex organs that cannot possibly come into existence step by step, because the different parts of the organ are of no benefit to the organism carrying it. And such examples demolish Darwin's theory, Yahya insists. Harun Yahya sees a great global conspiracy hatched by a scientific mafia consisting of scientific communities in universities, in scientific journals, and big scientific organizations promoting mainstream biology. The goal of such a materialist conspiracy is to weaken the nations of the world by undermining their moral and religious foundations. On this point, Yahya has much in common with both the modernist Afghani and the fundamentalist Maududi. Moving now to the world of Hinduism, where the story starts really in the late 19th century with a great Hindu leader called Swami Vivekananda. And we could say that he laid the foundations for new ways of talking and writing about science among Hindu leaders. Vivekananda always discussed science as part of a larger debate concerning the relationship between the East and the West. And in this debate, science was not presented as a threat to the Hindu worldview. Western science was in fact encompassed, was entailed by ancient Hindu philosophy, Vivekananda insisted. Modern scientific insights were included in Hindu texts, and the Western world was simply repeating many of the discoveries made in India 2,000 or even 3,000 years ago. If Christianity still dominated Europe, Charles Darwin would certainly have been burned by the Inquisition, Vivekananda wrote. Again, Vivekananda's attempts to entail modern science in the Hindu vision was part of a larger struggle to improve self-confidence among Hindus and create a platform, you might say, for a new Hindu identity, just as I argued with some of the Muslim leaders of the same period. Now, later Hindu writers, taking their cue, you might say, from Vivekananda, have produced mountains of books that aim to prove how the ancient Indian scientific tradition contained and encompassed modern scientific knowledge. Many of these books also claim that the only way to realize personal and social harmony is to return to ancient truths and abandon artificial boundaries between religion and science. These books have names such as India's Glorious Scientific Tradition, Modern Science in the Vedas, The Algebra of Vedic Science, and Human Devolution, a Vedic alternative to Darwin's theory. Most of these books are in Hindi and published for an Indian audience. For instance, one book by an author called Om Prakash Pandey, a professor of Sanskrit, explains how different terms and concepts of Vedic literature refer to scientific facts that have been discovered only recently by modern science. For instance, Pandey explains how the goddess Durga, worshipped by Hindus as Shakti, which means power, corresponds to the concept of energy known to modern physics. And he explains how references in the great Hindu epic, the Mahabharata, is evidence of advanced cloning technology in ancient India. This trend in Hindu thought today would perhaps be seen just as eccentric if it were not for the fact that this worldview is shared by powerful politicians. In the late 1990s and early 21st century, the huge Hindu fundamentalist and nationalist organization called the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, RSS for short, managed to put their leaders and ideologues into government through the political party Bharatiya Janata Party, BJP for short. The RSS believe that the differentiation of Hindu religion from other subsystems in Indian society was the result of colonialism and has proved to be a disaster for Hindus. They are also extremely suspicious of everything they see as foreign or alien to India, like Islam or Christianity, traditions with well over a millennium of history on the subcontinent. What we might call the Hinduization of science in India under the BJP government started as soon as their coalition had occupied the government offices in Delhi. And the man chosen for this task was one Mr. Murli Manohar Joshi, a very senior figure in the fundamentalist milieu of the RSS and the BJP. He has for a long time been the most important among the Hindu fundamentalist thinkers in the sphere of science. In addition to his fundamentalist or nationalist credentials, Joshi has a scientific background with a PhD in physics and a career as a university teacher. Through his ministership at the Ministry of Human Resource Development, which is also the head of the Ministry of Education, Mr. Joshi had great power to change the course of Indian policies on science and science education. And this he did. Few words about Buddhism before I wrap up. How am I on time now? Is this okay? Yeah. One often hears a claim that Buddhism is the world religion that is most compatible with modern science. Historians know that Buddhism, in its various local manifestations, is not more and not less scientific than other religions. But the point is that there has been this great campaign lately, or going on for some time, I think, to make Buddhism into the scientific religion of the modern age. And it has taken quite an effort by both Western and Asian leaders to do this. I think the story about this started in the late 19th century, in 1893 to be exact, at the World Parliament of Religions in Chicago. At the Parliament of Religions, one of the key people from the Buddhist world was Anagarika Dharmapala. And one of his big ideas at the Parliament was to present Buddhism as a scientific alternative to Christianity. This was, of course, a period when there was considerable, quite a lot of concern in the US, in the Christian world, about how to reconcile Christian doctrines with new scientific perspectives. And it was a very good time to launch a new scientific religion. And to bring home the message of Buddhism's scientific nature, Dharmapala picked a few central concepts from Buddhist philosophy and from modern science, and tried to show how these were interrelated. For instance, evolution was simply another word for the Buddhist concept of pratitya samutpada, he insisted. The pratitya samutpada, often translated as dependent origination, is a very important idea in Buddhist philosophy. It describes how the psychological and physical elements that make up a living being give rise to each other as cause and effect in a never-ending chain. In the same way, the scientific concept of law and effect was contained in the ancient Buddhist doctrine of karma, according to which any action, including motivations, have consequences later. Dharmapala would typically address his Western audiences by saying, quote, "The Buddha taught a scientific religion containing the highest individualistic, altruistic ethics and the cosmology which is in harmony with geology, astronomy, radioactivity, and reality." By showing how Charles Darwin's ideas and other ideas of modern science were part of ancient Buddhist teachings, Dharmapala implied that Buddhism both preceded and encompassed Western scientific tradition. Today, it seems to me that the same kind of attempt to reconcile Buddhism with science is continued by Western Buddhists, and among them are several well-known scholars, actually, of Buddhism. In the public imagination, the idea of Buddhism as a scientific religion is promoted in quite a clever way, I would say, by the Dalai Lama and other global Buddhist leaders. So I'll come to conclusions now. So it's quite obvious then to me that the motivations and aims of people espousing scientific Hinduism or scientific Buddhism are different from the goals of typical Christian fundamentalists. Christian fundamentalists reject the theory of evolution because it collides with religious doctrine, whereas the aim of scientific Buddhism is an adaptation to modernity and a defense of Buddhist culture by a strategy I think we might call encompassment. By claiming that all major scientific truths are contained in ancient texts and doctrines, both Hindu and Buddhist leaders want to demonstrate how their own traditions encompass and contain science. As we saw, the same strategy is not uncommon among Muslim thinkers who want to harmonize science with Islam. But in the Muslim world, we also find a strong rejection of science, of course, as in the work of Harun Yahya. So it may be reasonable to distinguish quite clearly between rejection and encompassment as two different strategies, because encompassment always entails allegorical readings of Scripture, whereas the strong rejection is mostly associated with the literalist interpretation of holy texts. So it seems that rejectionism is more of what we might call a true fundamentalist reaction than encompassment. So let me just briefly, summing up, let me just briefly return to the book I referred to in the start of my lecture called Strong Religion. It suggested that what they call the less triumphal demeanor of contemporary science will take wind out of the sails of fundamentalism. That's a quote. Now, I think there is reason to expect that human evolution will become even more of a contentious subject in the future. And there are several reasons for that. For instance, at the beginning of the 21st century, the struggle between anti-evolutionists and science-friendly modernists seemed to harden in several Muslim societies, most notably Turkey. It is not unlikely that this conflict will become more pronounced in the future, and one reason is that many Muslim societies only quite recently have been able to implement systems of mass education, exposing larger sections of their populations to the worldview of modern science. And if you look at recent statistics from big Muslim societies, it seems to be the case that evolution is a difficult worldview to reconcile with Islam in many places. And then there is what is now called the new atheism, of course. Strong Religion was published in 2002, and that was 4 years before the publication of The God Delusion and the heated debates that followed that infamous book. Even though the authors of Strong Religion may be right when they claim that the recent developments in science itself is about to free up metaphysical space, as I said, I think it's quite obvious that representatives of this new atheism are doing what they can to occupy that space. It is also clear that new atheism sees science as a very important ally in the struggle against organized religion. Both atheism as a life stance and the much wider category of non-religion are successful in several countries today. And it seems that the future relationship between religion and science is influenced, in part at least, by the extent to which this new atheism is able to appropriate science in its missionary activity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We shall move down the line, so I'll ask Dr. Abu Hadib to give your observations, actually. Thank you.
Yes. I too would like to start by thanking the Ramsey Center for hosting this event and for Torkel for inviting me to be part
Pleasure.
of this. And Torkel provides a lot of interesting food for thought, I think. And I will offer a contribution which comes from my own field, which is the field of history, modern history of the Middle East, specifically cultural and social history, and more specifically the Arab East. And I would like to start by proposing to classify religious reactions into two broad sets of reactions, one of them cultural and the other social. The first referring to reaction to science as a cultural import, and the other one referring to the inter-social struggle over locating sources of authority. And to start with the cultural level, this particularly reflects on the relationship between East and West and how it is understood in relation to science. And I'll be referring back to some of what Torkel mentioned. But to give a view from the late 19th and early 20th century, science and technology were widely viewed by the intellectual environment of the Arab East as the secret to the West's success. And progress along those lines was regarded as vital for the rejuvenation of culture. And as far as Muslim thinkers were concerned, it was possible to divorce the technical and scientific achievements of Western modernity on the one hand from its moral and cultural aspects. And the prevalent view of several thinkers from this period was that Islam was perfectly capable of accommodating science and therefore progress. Thus, one of the ideas was that it wasn't necessary for Islam to go through the same crisis that Christianity went in its encounter with science. And at the same time, neither was science perceived as exclusively Western. A common argument from the time was that just as sciences emerged in an Islamic civilization and then were borrowed by the West, Islamic civilization can reclaim the sciences back from the West, which would be a process of reclamation rather than importation. And one of the ideas floating around at that time was that the theory of evolution was first suggested by classical Muslim scholars before Darwin. And this view was adopted by some of the most influential Islamic modernists, one of them, whom Torkel mentions, Jamaluddin Afghani. And the main point here is that the separation between science and religion and the language used to discuss them was adopted, translated, and accompanied by an attempt to redefine the relationship between the two and to reconcile them. Some of these elements persist today, especially concerning the compatibility of Islam and science. I'm going to refer to one example, the Abdul Majid Zindani, a Yemeni cleric who had started studying the sciences but then never completed his studies. And he explains the difference between Christian and Muslim attitudes to science as a difference between their respective religious texts. An example he gives is the story of Adam. And he argues that in the Quran, whereas science is a cause for honoring Adam, in the Old Testament it's a cause for expelling him from paradise. And here it's interesting because the word that is used, the ilm, means both science and knowledge. So he's referring to the tree of knowledge. And when he discusses the crisis in Christianity's early reception of science, he refers to the sciences as our sciences, meaning the Muslim sciences. And in this regard, it's also interesting to mention the Commission on Scientific Science in the Quran and the Sunnah, which he helped found in the 1980s under the auspices of the Saudi Arabian government. And this commission has as a mission finding scientific science in the text of Islam, and it's still functioning today. So this is as far as the cultural level is concerned. On the social level, again, I'm going to go back from an example from historical point of view before coming forth in time again. At the turn of the 19th century, at the end of the 19th century, science held the promise of breaking with tradition and redefining the religious authority. And here again, it's interesting to note a linguistic occurrence, which is that the word for scientist, alim, was also used for religious scholars. Only today it's used predominantly for science, to describe scientists. But this only serves to underline the element of struggle over the definition of knowledge and sources of authority. So here to look at an incident in the 1890s when the ruler of Egypt tried to reform Al-Azhar, and Al-Azhar is a center of religious learning in Cairo, which dates back to the 10th century. At the time, it was primarily religious learning. It has been reformed during the 20th century, especially under Jamal Abdel Nasser, and it's become a different institution. But at the time, there was widespread agreement that the Azhar needed to be reformed, and the reforms that were suggested at the time were to introduce modern sciences, scientific subjects, which started riots by students of Al-Azhar, and they clashed with the police. And it's easy to adopt the view at the time, which was adopted by the press and the British authorities in Egypt, that this was a fanatic reaction. But then a closer look shows that there is also, it can only be properly understood as a reaction against state intervention in what had historically been an autonomous institution. And a lot of the 19th century state reforms, science was often used by the state, certainly the Egyptian state, as a spearhead for expanding its sphere of influence. And this did provoke reactions in several spheres, not just the sciences. I mean, other elements of centralization, such as taxation and conscription, also provoked violent reactions. But this is only again to point out that the intra-social struggles over the allocation of political and religious authority need also to be taken into consideration in order to understand the relationship of strong reaction against introduction of scientific subjects. As for the situation today, there are a variety of reactions across the Muslim world, including the Arab world, regarding the compatibility of Islam with science. And one interesting phenomenon is one pointed out by Torkel, which is the foregrounding of organized creationism in Turkey and its relationship with creationism elsewhere. In the case of Turkey, just to go back to the social and cultural factors, in the case of Turkey, it would be difficult to understand this phenomenon in the purely cultural sphere, as in relations between East and West. It needs to be placed in the social struggle over the sources of authority, particularly in a society where secularism had been hegemonic for decades before the Justice and Development Party recently started to play a leading role in politics. As for the Arab world, Torkel mentioned education as a possible reason why similar movements have not emerged yet. And there are other factors that I would like to suggest, and perhaps we can discuss them a bit more later, which is that after World War II, there was an increasing trend to remove religion from public life. And this was done again by secularizing states, Arab states, who were attempting to bring religion under its control. But over the past 2 decades or so, the political picture has changed, and there's an increasing accommodation between so-called secular regimes and religious authorities, coupled with a very tight control over civic rights, which has not left much room for science to play a role in the arena of intra-social struggles over authority. So perhaps we can look more into this in the discussion and the questions, but just to end the note that any understanding of the relationship between science and Islam present or future, we need to take both these aspects into consideration. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Gombrich.
Well, good evening. Thank you for inviting me. My name is Richard Gombrich, and I am founder of the Oxford Centre for Buddhist Studies and its academic director. If anybody at the back can't hear me because I am not using a microphone, thank your lucky stars and take the opportunity for a nap. May I congratulate you on your brevity, which I shall try but fail to emulate. Now, if you're given any given number of minutes, whether that number is 2 or 200 or whatever, and asked to cover a topic in that time, if you know what question you're supposed to answer, I think you can do it. It's not too difficult, even in 1 minute. You can tailor your answer to the time available. But I don't know what question I'm being asked, and so that makes my task very, very, very difficult. In fact, I'd say it's impossible. Let me say that, well, I could look at Buddhism and science from perhaps 3 points of view. And this is not necessarily in any particular order, but just let me just open today's Times Literary Supplement at page 13. Modern Buddha. The review is of a book by Owen Flanagan called The Bodhisattva's Brain, and it's by Evan Thompson, who is Professor of Philosophy at the University of Toronto, which is a good university. Let me just read you very little bit from the beginning. In 1904, William James heard a Sinhalese Buddhist named Anagarika Dharmapala, whom we've already heard of, lecture at Harvard University on the Theravada Buddhist view of the mind. Afterwards, William James rose and proclaimed to the audience, "This is the psychology everybody will be studying 25 years from now." James's prediction proved to be too optimistic, but it may yet come true. Today, studies of the effects of Buddhist meditation practices on the brain and behavior appear almost every month in scientific journals, while cognitive scientists are devising new ways to investigate the mind and brain with experimental participants who have refined their attentional skills through long-term meditation practice. Meanwhile, a growing number of Western philosophers are taking an interest in Buddhist theories of mind as well as Buddhist ethical theories. Some of you may not yet be aware that there is a recognized center, the Oxford Centre for Mindfulness Studies, at which there are master's degree courses in which people are trained to help other people achieve mindfulness for therapeutic purposes, and that a compulsory part of that master's degree course is in Buddhist theories of meditation. So Buddhism has really got its foot in the door there, more than a foot, an arm and a leg, I would say. Since the 19th century, one of the striking features of the Buddhist encounter with modernity has been the way both Asian Buddhists and Western Buddhist converts have argued that Buddhism, unlike other religions, especially Christianity, is not only compatible with science but contains a kind of mind science, a precise specification of how the mind works and how proper mental training leads to liberation from mental suffering. This was the principal strategy Anagarika Dharmapala used in combating Christian colonialism in his native Ceylon and in his promotion of Theravada Buddhism in the West, as William James heard at Harvard. That's one aspect of it. Of course, this is really a branch of psychiatry, of increasing human flourishing or human welfare. It's science very much in the sense that medicine in general is a science. It's empirical, it's somewhat imprecise, it's feeling its way, but it's very difficult nowadays to claim that all this is rubbish. That's the first part of my talk. The second part of my talk is simply to tell you that, in my view, about 99% of what is talked about Buddhism and science is complete and utter rubbish. And that's all the part that isn't about the mind and the discoveries, the empirical advance, not so much, although Buddhist doctrine does play a part, but very much also through Buddhist practice and traditions passed on by teachers to pupils of how to meditate, what the results will be, and how to manipulate your own mind and benefit therefrom. So that leaves me the third part of my talk. Now, I think here we are trying to compare different religions in how they are vis-à-vis science. There was a very famous professor called Arthur Darby Nock, who was one of the founders of comparative religion, and he was an Englishman, but he taught at Harvard, and he was very famous for saying that in attempting to compare two things, it is as well to know something about at least one of them. That's what I always feel about religion and science. This is a horribly fashionable subject, and therefore, as I've already indicated, does have a great deal of rubbish talked in it. But how are we actually seeing that Christianity and Buddhism, for example, with the monotheistic religions and the non-monotheistic religions, are so wildly different that almost all comparisons are just completely and utterly muddled and misguided? How are we to look at them in a specific context, asking a specific question? I think that epistemology is an important place to start. And because that is something you really can compare across cultures and across traditions. There's a very famous text in the oldest set of Buddhist scriptures, the Pali Canon, in which some people come to the Buddha and ask him how they are to decide between the various teachings that they've been propounded by various teachers who've come by. And the Buddha says that everyone has to make up his own mind on such matters. One should not take any teaching on trust or external authority, but test it on the touchstone of one's own experience. This is so famous that, of course, all the modern books that people write about Buddhism to introduce them in, because they want people to like Buddhism, this usually comes by page 2 or page 3. Yes. The Buddha speaks to the Kalamas. It may be tempting to argue that the Buddha was here inculcating the attitude of modern scientific inquiry. And of course, there is some similarity, but I would say it's limited. Ideally, at least, it certainly is a part of modern education to encourage everyone to think for themselves, and that doesn't apply only to science and scientists. But when we teach science, we do not advise students to begin by questioning absolutely everything in their field, because if they did that, they would have to spend their entire lives trying to recapitulate the history of their subject. They would never reach the current problem situation, let alone pass their exams. Nor are they expected to judge most matters by their own experience. That only comes into play when they finally qualify to conduct real experiments. So the fact that the Buddha, as I haven't time to explain here, but the Buddha certainly had a very empirical attitude to knowledge, is interesting but not terribly relevant at this particular point in the argument. Though the Buddhist text does not spell this out, the context makes it obvious that the reference is to religious teaching, not to a secular topic, whether theoretical like maths or practical like pottery. The implication is that people will find out for themselves through experience that the Buddha's teaching is correct and leads to the lessening of suffering and ultimately to its elimination. This, in my view, brings us to a massive and fundamental contrast between Buddhism and science, and indeed I would suggest between all religions and science. Buddhists believe that the truth has already been discovered by the Buddha. What remains up to them is simply to realize it, to experience it. For this, they will require intellectual understanding, but also, based on that understanding, a realization which admits of no doubt, for it is not an intellectual realization alone. By contrast, modern science is based on the doctrine that the final truth, if there even is such a thing as the final truth, very dubious, has not been discovered, that many things we now think true will soon turn out not to be so, and that we have not yet even discovered all the problems, let alone their solutions. Thus, although the Buddha made impressive use of reason and argument, in this basic sense his teaching is not scientific at all. Nor, I would add, as a personal remark, do I regard this as a relevant criticism of it. I regard Buddhism and science, indeed I regard religion and science, as entirely incommensurable. So, what about just the basis about epistemology? Ancient India developed a system of formal logic, just as did ancient Greece. It was a different one, but it worked. Logic is logic in both countries. And they were very concerned with valid means of knowledge. The difference between the Hindus and the Buddhists was that one of the valid means of knowledge for the Hindus was scripture, or the statements of wise men, or inspired men. And this indeed was accepted in a way by the Buddhists in the early centuries, because the Buddha was considered to be an authority, although he claimed that his only authority was an empirical knowledge that he had experienced for himself. We may doubt that, but that was his view of himself. But gradually, Buddhism did come completely to reject the idea that there is a voice of authority. Only in perception, empirical knowledge, and logical reasoning were considered to be valid means of knowledge by the Buddhists. And I think I've run out of time, so I have to leave it there.
Thank you very much. Thank you. From more Christian perspective, Stan Rosenberg. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, pleasure to join you. My thanks to the Ramsey Center for organizing this and bringing this panel together and us to interact with you. I'm speaking to this from several standpoints, which Andrew asked me to address it from when he contacted me. My area of scholarship is early Christianity, and particularly early Christian appropriations of science and their interpretations of Genesis. So I work with latent cosmology in the context of Greco-Roman science. But I don't do only that. I've looked at the reception of that in later periods, and particularly I'm in the midst of a funded grant project looking at the research and teaching of religion and science in Christian liberal arts universities in the United States. And so it's from that particular context that I bring some remarks tonight at the invitation of the center. So I have three basic areas I would like to address in this. The first is to take up some historiographical and interpretive concerns which amount to a question about not treating Christian fundamentalism as a caricature or homogenizing all forms of fundamentalism. So 7 comments on this point. First, many in this room will be aware that there's an outdated and fundamentally flawed conflict thesis, which was presented first in the 19th century by Draper and White. And it's important to separate this out from current conversation, that the conflict thesis has been shown to have been a fabrication, to be fundamentally flawed, and yet it shows up regularly still with discussions of fundamentalism in science. I think it's very important that as we engage this, we be able to set that particular debate aside. It doesn't mean that there isn't discussion to be had, but the conflict thesis fundamentally does not help us engage questions of fundamentalism. Secondly, I think it's important to note the inherent conservatism of fundamentalism, not to describe that merely as anti-intellectualism. That is, again, something that often happens, describing fundamentalists as anti-intellectual, particularly in the American context. And while there is certainly within the United States a tradition of anti-intellectualism, of which I regret and have had to work through on my own, it would be wrong to, again, homogenize that and describe that as the whole picture. It's often one finds a harkening back, not merely to ancient texts, but earlier religious views and earlier scientific views. And so you find within fundamentalists, those who would be described as fundamentalist writers, a harkening back to a generation of scientists 1, 2, 3, 4 generations back. There are further reasons that I'll go into for that, but I think it's important to note that sometimes what is described as anti-intellectualism is actually more of a form of conservatism about earlier forms of science. Thirdly, it's important to note that both fundamentalists and secularists have bought into what is another deeply flawed theory, and that's the classical theory of secularization. That has largely been rejected. We look at people like Grace Davies, Dave Martin, Peter Berger, others. There have been substantial revision of the classical theory of secularization, which if you're not familiar with it, This is the theory that says as a society becomes more modern, it becomes more secular. So advance of modernity leads to advance of secularism. Well, that secularization thesis has helped create a deep distrust, and a deep distrust of those methods that creates secularism. So many fundamentalists, if you will, buy into the secularization theory. They've accepted that flawed approach to understanding reality, as have many of the new atheists. And so they have become ideological opponents on the same battlefield that they have accepted. And it doesn't help advance knowledge. And so we have a militant secular positioning, accepting that thesis, advancing it, and a militant religious reactionism, both of which add fire but not light. Fourthly, speaking of Christianity in Americas, I think it's important to note that the kind of Christianity found in America is often born in part of the same common sense approach to reality that led Johnson to kick a stone. So Scottish realism has played a very important role in the development of the American religious tradition, the American intellectual religious tradition, and the more popular tradition. And this Scottish realism, the Baconian approach as well, has really been fundamental. And so that leads to some rejection of some forms of current development in science. Now, I think we also fifthly, need to beware of homogenizing the reactions, as there are a substantial number of positive reactions from religious conservatives. And this was, in fact, largely the reaction to Darwinian science until the 1950s. It's only with the publication of The Genesis Flood by Leon Morris in 1951 that there develops what can be described as a common sort of reaction that one can readily postulate as a strong reaction to Darwinian science. It was often left unattended or uninterested or even accepted by on multiple fronts. Sixth point on this, on the methodological concern, is I think we need to acknowledge, I'm not a proponent of intelligent design, I want to say as a part of this, but I think one has to acknowledge the utility of intelligent design theorists in the United States because it's brought some doubters, that is young Earth creationists, who otherwise would have rejected all forms of science, it has actually brought them to accepting substantial parts of science. And so it has had a positive utility in opening up the door to some degrees of science. Whether one likes the particular form of intelligent design or not, it's actually had, I think, quite a constructive place. It's an ironic sort of place to give it, but I think it's important to note it and give credit where credit is due. Finally, on this methodological side of my comments, I think it's important to note the rejection certainly indeed happens, but I would be uncomfortable with describing all fundamentalist reaction to science as being rejectionism, because it is a substantially more varied approach. If you know anything about religion in America, it is multifaceted, and one has to be very careful of sweeping broadsides. Several comments on factors that have inhibited the trust of scientists within religious fundamentalism in North America we're finding. And there are many authors who have written on this. I'm not saying anything new, but I am trying to bring some synthesis together. I think the first thing one has to note that is the strong tendency in North American Christianity towards activism and social justice. And this was seen in the history of abolition, the temperance movements, prison reform, and women's suffrage, just to mention a few. And that form of activism means there is, coupled with a second form of factor one often finds of pietism, means that there's often just a plain old disinterest in science and areas of study in their own right for their own sake. So the first was activism, the second was the pietist tradition. The third, related to that, is the emphasis on conversion, revivalism, and the centrality of the cross within American Christian, both evangelical and fundamentalist traditions. And so this presents a strong emphasis on the religious life, and in some ways, maybe find a partner, perhaps this is a bit ironic to describe it, but in some ways, Stephen Gould's description of non-overlapping magisteria in some ways is not inappropriate because of the way that people would respond. They might not like it for the way Gould would have said it or the position Gould would take, but it led to this kind of disinterest, if you will, because of the magisteria that they were particularly interested in. So they would just leave the other aside happily. Third third comment, and this perhaps here we begin to see some correspondence to some of the other traditions, is a theological doubt about the authority of reason. Now, as Peter Harrison, the former director of the Ramsey Center, has already written at length and very substantially, this view of this doubt about the authority of reason in the early modern period helped give rise to a modern experimentalism, and I refer you to Harrison's many fine works on that. So there is a stance of skepticism then that evolves about modern methods. Now, I think it's important also to note that with this doubt about the authority of reason that helped give rise to experimentalism, as you have to can't trust your mind, so you just keep retrying the same experience over and over because we can't trust that we will come to our own inference properly. I think we can find that modern doubters have not bought into Popper's redefinition of science as what can be demonstrated as patently falsifiable. Because of that, there is that, the state of Missouri has on its license plates, it's the Missouri motto, which is show me. It's the show me state. And that is very much the approach, the tradition that one finds within American religion, often the conservative sides of it. Inference, therefore, is not sufficient. One needs something more than inference. And so there's a greater concern for experimental and inductive over inferential science. And to the extent that modern science depends on inference, which it does in many areas, it becomes a source of doubt. That is, it doesn't encourage strong trust within it. Of course, also this doubt on authority of reason is added to, secondly, by metaphysical claims made by science via inference rather than by induction. And we find notable scientists or notable science writers, as the case may be, making vast metaphysical claims, though not often accepting that they're making metaphysical claims. And those are easily seen through, and what it often leads to then within these traditions is not just rejection of the claim, but rejection of the science that helped create the scientist and their claim. And that, of course, leads to some of the battles. So it's related to this, then we see scientists treating absolute, that which is provisional. And it is a rejection of that absolutism that leads to some throwing off the science. Now, there are other things within the other factors. Biblicism, that is a focus on infallibility and inerrancy within American Christianity that have added to it. It's important to note that those terms are 19th century terms, and while they reflect in some ways earlier traditions, that is a strong view of the authority of Scripture, by enunciating it in these newly defined words, it gives it a new place in the development of 19th century Christianity in North America and subsequently in other places influenced by this language. Well, let me just take about 2 more minutes just to say a few things about what we're finding in some of these Christian colleges, and then I'll bring this to a close. It's important to note that higher education in America is very diverse, large, and confusing. There are over 4,400 degree-granting accredited higher education institutions in the United States, over 4,400, of which there are 1,676 public institutions, 2,733 private institutions. Of those 2,700 plus private institutions, 900 still are religiously affiliated. So it's a large, dynamic situation of culture, and one has to be careful of overstating things or too broadly stating them. But some things that we are seeing when we look at these colleges. It's important to note that many of these colleges in the United States began as Bible colleges and have grown into liberal arts colleges and universities. Well, the tradition, because these are young colleges, relatively speaking, at least by British standards. These are European standards, when you look at Bologna. These are still young colleges, and so their tradition of being mission schools or Bible schools, or these have been planted by ethnic communities to represent their culture in many ways as well. They still bear some of the traditions and influence of that, and that's an important piece to note of it. It's also important to note that STEM teaching, know this acronym STEM for science, technology, engineering, and medicine. STEM teaching in Christian arts colleges averages about 7% of the graduating population. Broadly in the United States, STEM population is 15%, so it's about half that of what one finds in graduates in science. Now, that is not a fact or factoid that should be taken fully in its own right, because that represents all U.S. colleges and universities. And so you have major state universities like Michigan State with 60,000 students, or Penn State, which are going to have vast science programs, and that's not commensurate with a small liberal arts college. It's also important to note that what we're finding is a prevalence of biological sciences in these colleges, because many of them are focusing on allied health, pre-med, and other supporting fields in preparing their students. And physics labs, as you know, are very expensive. And so one of the areas of science teaching that is not prevalent within Christian arts colleges is physics. There will be basic physics, if you will, introductory level, but there is not an extensive level of upper level physics. And that's very important, because in science religion debates, physics is the science that's the most accommodating to the debates and discussions, whereas biology is the least accommodating. It's where the most contention has happened. So should we be surprised when more contention is seen if those are the sciences that are being emphasized in the educational programs? So I think we need to take into account the social and cultural developments. And finally, it's important to note that it's very easy to find worst case scenarios, bad stories. Of course those happen. But what doesn't happen very well is reporting on the good things. So for example, Calvin College in Michigan this year had 2 Goldwater Fellowships awarded to it. Now the Goldwater Fellowship in the United States is the premier undergraduate fellowship in science. Harvard had how many Goldwater Fellowships this year? 2. Harvard had the same number as Calvin. Calvin is about 1/10 the size of Harvard, and its budget is, 2% of Harvard's. So there are, and this is not the first time. This is not an unusual happening. In fact, 3 years ago, Calvin received more Goldwater Fellowships than Harvard did. So there are some very good stories to be said for what's happening within science as well, even as one here's reported some horror stories. So I think I'll leave it at that. I'm sorry to take too long.
Thank you very much. Okay, thank you. Well, there was no way we were going to finish by 1:45 because it's gone that already. The initial plan was to have each member of the panel make a comment back, but actually that doesn't give you enough time.
That's right.
So basically, it's an open floor, and I'll try and sort of see as many people who want to make a comment as possible, who want to come back on any of the contributions. Well,
I apologise, not of rudeness, but I do have a bus to catch.
Fine.
May I make one comment?
Do.
If you don't mind. I think we've gone backwards during the last hour and a half or so, or hour and a quarter, because we began with a very interesting thesis by Torkel Brekke, which I think there's a great deal to be said for, that fundamentalism should be defined in terms of differentiation in the institutions. So it's a concept, a sociological concept, and that it is therefore something that can be applied to all religions, and is closely allied to secularism. Now, we've suddenly started treating fundamentalism in all kinds of different ways, very often to do with the psychology of somebody or something. This isn't a psychological concept at all. I know it's the job of academics, even outside duty hours, to try to muddle things up by making them terribly, terribly complicated. But I don't like this, and I protest against it. And I don't agree at all with my neighbor on the left, that certain idols like David Martin, Peter Berger, and other people who mentioned, all of whom I've read and some of whom I've known, necessarily have got it right. Secularism, again, is a sociological concept. And I've seen a great debate between Brian Wilson and David Martin, in which Brian Wilson, who was a sociologist, of course David Martin is too, but also he's a church minister, were arguing this out. And I think that Brian Wilson, for me, got 100 against 0, because he absolutely logically proved point by point that if you talk about secularism or differentiation, if you like, this is a one-way movement as society moves along. It doesn't mean to say that the people who are now using, shall we say, medical doctors rather than witch doctors to cure their illnesses, don't themselves have religious beliefs, religious practices, and religious emotions. It's nothing to do with that. It's a sociological concept. And I think that we've just completely lost sight of that in this discussion. And I would like to get back to this very fundamental thing, which I think was expounded for us at the beginning. That's my controversial view. Okay? Not controversial with everybody.
Well, one of the things which actually, having just come out of a sort of a background in teaching doctrine, that in Christian doctrine, that nothing has ever been developed in doctrinal terms within the church without it having some link to the societal setting in which the church is on. Yeah, but it still seems to fit the same thing, really. Anyway. Silence out there at the moment. Yes?
I don't know really very much about this at all, but I was just struck that everyone who's spoken about science seems to have spoken about evolution and Darwinism. And I just wondered whether there were other aspects of science, and I suppose I was thinking about the more modern things in terms of the possibilities of genetic manipulation, that whole aspect of how human identity would be changed. Would shed any light on that? And if that doesn't ring any bells, move on to the next observation, please.
In the Christian context, that's only begun to be thought about. So this is in terms of the questions of the new humans, the transhumanism. This is a debate that Christian theologians, some here at Oxford, are beginning to really engage the question of, but it's really, it's very much on the cusp of a new kind of conversation, and I think still at quite a jejune stage.
Well, I think it's a good question because I mean there's so many books coming out, sort of looking at. Because your question is really about religious ethics, and ethics in world religions is a very big topic. So you have books looking at how Hindus, Buddhists, Muslims look at biotechnology, look at all these things that you're asking, and so this is a very big topic right now. I don't know very much about it, and I haven't seen studies of how sort of fundamentalists look at these more ethical problems. And I would suspect that it would be a very mixed picture, because if you look at, I mean, if you look at many, you could find fundamentalists in Christianity and Islam who have very conservative views about certain areas of ethics, and then completely libertarian views about, say, economic aspects of society. So it would be a very mixed picture, I think. So that's the best I can say, but it's not very good.
No, thank you. Anybody else? Yeah.
Can I go back to a sort of a root and say that I've always been very unhappy with the very word fundamentalist. That it is bandied around regularly and very rarely defined. And I suspect that covers the fact that it tends to be interpreted as literalism somehow and unintelligence. Whereas, if I'm right, it was developed in America in an evangelical background to do with getting back to the fundamentals, i.e. what was important. And it wasn't really about simply taking everything totally literally. And I just, I throw that in, that it seems to me that there's a danger that because we don't define this term, we pursue the wrong things sometimes.
I think I think you're correct, because it actually comes out of the Princeton School of Theology, being back to the fundamentals, and but you're probably more up to date with that school of theology than I am.
Well, I think that's a very important piece, and that's part of, with regards to my to Richard on my right, the reason why I would have severe doubts about the kind of fundamentalism that he would want to deal with here, because it's overly reductive. It's not the question whether there's a sociological basis in part for dealing with it, but to reduce it purely to a sociological phenomena I think doesn't deal with a group of people and a set of ideas with the dignity that it deserves. So it's an overly reductive position.
But his question is good, because yes, you're quite right that fundamentalism as a word is used in a number of different ways. And that's the reason why I wrote this book. Because, I mean, on the one hand, you have scholars saying that, no, you can't use the word fundamentalism about anything apart from the original Protestant Christian fundamentalists in America starting in the 10 something. And on the other hand, you have media saying that, oh, everybody's a fundamentalist. If you stop smoking or start jogging, you're a fundamentalist because you're a health fundamentalist. So on the one hand, you have an extremely narrow concept of fundamentalism, and on the other hand, you have an extremely wide concept of fundamentalism. And I think that was the reason why I think it's a good idea to sort of say precisely what we mean by this word. And that's why I also agree with Professor Richard Gombrich about, that we should be quite precise in what it means. And if we want to look at secularization and reactions against it, we have to take secularization apart and look at what is right about it and what did we get wrong about secularization theory. And some parts of secularization theory is actually right. Well, to my mind, anyway. So
but the theory is really still evolving, isn't it? I mean, the classical theory state, it's very hard to hold that in a whole full structure now because it's been taken by various parts. It doesn't mean one rejects the whole. Well, it doesn't mean one rejects every part of it, but as a whole encompassing theory to understand development, it's satisfactory, isn't it?
In its early and primitive forms, I agree totally. But if we pull it apart, I think it's there still something to be said for certain aspects of secularization theory, maybe.
I would just like to ask you whether you've ever heard of a religious reform movement which didn't say it was getting back to fundamentals. Does that tell us anything?
I'm not sure.
But I'm being so wildly misrepresented on my left that I must defend myself. I did not define fundamentalism in reductionist terms. What I said was that we had been offered a very good, useful definition of fundamentalism here as a reaction to a phenomenon which I believe is really something precise which one can talk about. It's a sociological concept. Secularization is not a state of mind. And that we're being offered, you can define fundamentalism as a penchant for drinking green tea, if you like, but it's not going to be useful in the discussion. I thought we were offered a very useful definition of it, which we could discuss. And that doesn't mean to say that I have any kind of reductionist program whatsoever. I can't see what reductionism has to do with it.
Can I come back to your point, having thought about it a little bit? My suggestion would be that one of the difficulties here is the question of whether you think there is actually an authority for our understanding things in religion. And one may talk about getting back to the fundamentals, because that's attractive. We'll go back to what's important. But the question is there truth, and where do we get it from?
Sure, that is the question. And it depends whether you're religious or scientific about it, doesn't it? Because scientists use definition as a working tool. And religionists think that there is such a thing as fundamentalism, which I think is absolutely misguided. There is, for the purposes of a discussion, and the clearer you can make it, the better. And then you'll get somewhere if you use a clear working definition, but all definitions are working definitions. They are not, in my view, given by God.
For a few years I've been thinking of this this notion that religion and science are incommensurable. But I've abandoned this idea recently because science often has a worldview which encompasses the whole world. and religion often has the same. So there's inevitably going to be points of contact or conflict. So that this idea that it's incommensurable, I think, just cannot work.
How about love?
Love.
Yes.
What's the relevance of this to this discussion?
Well, religion would have one view about love, science might have another view about love. They would could both be equally right or equally wrong, and so on. They're just not commensurable, are they? If a biologist talks about human love, and a poet talks about human love,
Just one person.
are those commensurable?
No. Start with that.
What do you mean by incommensurability?
But they're not. I'm saying they are incommensurable.
What do you mean by what does it mean?
Because they're taught in different universities of discourse. It's just like if I start singing, my music is a completely different sort of thing from if I start doing logical deductions or something. They're just quite different. They can't meet. One can't knock out the other.
So the love, when you use the word in one context, it cannot be used in any relationship or any context in another.
If you say, I love my children and so on, whatever a scientist says about love is not relevant to your feeling of love of children, and it can't be refuted or confirmed by it.
I'm going to draw this bit to a close, fascinating as it is. And neither Fern nor Torkel have actually managed to get a word in edgeways at the moment. I'm going to offer you a chance to sort of make a comment, and then we'll draw to an end. Which one of you two would like to start?
I can start, yes.
Yeah.
The thing is that I would like to go back again to one of the fundamentals, so to speak, of Torkel's idea about fundamentalism, which is, first of all, there's this differentiation of spheres, but another thing which we haven't talked much about is his idea that globalization is also an integral part of the process. And that's a process that started from the 1850s on. And again, I would like to return to the issue of Islam and to look specifically in that context, because one of the things that I mentioned was the reaction to science as something which was or wasn't important. That's what was kind of the part of the debate. But that the fact that there was no tradition of experimental sciences, it had more political and social significance in that context. And which is interesting because it thinks a bit to what Fern was saying about how Darwinism is perceived as something which links to theories of racism and Nazism and what have you. And so again here, to come back to this idea of, it's interesting that more than 100 years later, going back to Darwin and seeing it more from this culturalist point of view, because one of this commission for scientific science, which is based in Mecca, which looks for scientific science in the Quran. One of the articles in its publications is specifically looking at Darwin's theory of evolution. And the interesting part is that in trying to refute it, there's only a minimum of theological arguments, and the rest of it is basically political and social significance.
Sorry, that was more.
No, that's fine. Thank you very much indeed. We need to wrap it up at this point. Big thanks to Torkel for introducing this and the book and the other contributors for the very varied sort of insights that they've offered. It's been fascinating. So thank you all very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you.